Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the September version of our Requirement Working Group Exhchange Cafe. This session we're going to dedicate to a discussion about interfaces, what an interface is, identifying interfaces, assessing risk associated with interfaces, defining interfaces and where to document those definitions, writing interface requirements and where to document those, how the role of interface requirements comes in with systems integration, system verification, and system validation, and then just managing interfaces. The Needs and Requirements Manual covers all these topics in quite a bit more detail. Future meetings that we have in October, November, we're going to focus on developing a guide to system security needs and requirements, verification, validation. That's tailoring that guide to what's in our products. In December, Heinrich is going to give us a presentation as a follow-on to a presentation he gave last year, the week before IW. And then in January, we'll have our IW sessions. The specific agenda is still TBD, but we're still planning on having 2 days of presentations the week prior to IW. So if any of you have a presentation you'd like to give or a topic you'd like it to be addressed, then send Tammy and I an email and let us know. And then the sessions during IW, Tech Ops is the encouraging collaboration with other working groups. So we'll have several sessions dealing with the other working groups. In addition to our own RWG topics, we'll give a status of what happened the previous year, our plans for 2023. And then one of the things that we've been working on, and you all should have gotten an email from Tammy requesting that you all review the Guide to Writing Requirements version 3.1 that we put out in May, and give us any comments you have on that. We want to expand the examples beyond just functional performance. So if you have any specific examples that we could put into the guide, that would be great. For all these questions that we're talking about, one thing I'd ask for you to send me questions. And so to get started, Suri sent these questions, and I see you're on, Suri. So do you want to kick off this discussion and talk about your first question?
Yes. So yeah, I think these questions just popped up to have a better understanding of how others also perceive as interfaces. So there are, when we say interface, there are interfaces that we talk at the architecture level. There are interfaces in the context of the context diagrams and the system boundaries and stuff. And then there are a separate, I'm trying to tailor it to how that will transform into some sort of a documentation if we are still in that document-based world as opposed to data-centric world. So the basis of asking these questions, the first one is, are interface requirements a separate section of subsystem or system requirements? Intuition says that it should be a part of those documentation anyway, but that kind of a question surprised me, and I was taken aback when it has been raised. So I was just curious if the way we perceive these things are any different.
I think that is important. When we talk about levels of the system, each different level of the system will have different interfaces. And like the specification of that level, likewise, the interface specification will look different at different levels of the system.
Now, what do you mean by interface specification?
How you define the interface at that level of the system.
Would that be like an ICD, like you asked, or some other type of a document?
Yes, and an ICD would look different at different levels of the system.
Because it's addressing different interactions.
Yes, yes.
Just if I can add a little bit, Henrik Mathfolk, Whirlpool. So the way we deal with the interface requirements is that we basically see those as, well, whatever entity you work with, it can be your system level or a subsystem. We kind of look at the boundary of that entity and identify interfaces there. And then basically the interface requirement will basically just communicate which interface that is required by that entity to implement. So we're saying things like provide or maybe even obtain, but especially provide an interface. So that is kind of specified by the interface requirements for the entity that you're currently working with. It can be a system level interface. You have the interface requirement in the system requirement, but it's just kind of outlining which interface you need to implement. And then the ICD outlines the characteristics of the interface, both from a form and functional perspective, what is kind of flowing, characterizing what is flowing across that interface. And so the interface requirement in our case is merely kind of pointing to a certain version of the ICD, essentially. So that's how we deal with it, right or wrong. But
no, that's a common way of doing it. Any other comments?
Francesco here, General Computer Ray Observatory. In our world, the decomposition of requirements and interfaces can have multiple levels. So we agree with what has been said before. What concerns me a little bit is, in this first question, is the fact that interface requirement specifications are treated as equal to interface control documents. In my understanding, these two are different documents. So interface control documents basically are documents controlling interfaces agreed between two or more parties. They have to cooperate in order to develop the interface in question. So, and often ICDs are used to capture requirements when, in my understanding, requirements should be captured in interface requirement specification or embedded into the system requirement specification in some subsections. Thank you.
My take on the first question is in reality, interface requirements are just a form of a functional performance requirement. And when we use the word interface, sometimes it kind of encompasses a whole lot of things. So I think about more the word interaction than the word interface. And we're really talking about interactions between our system of interest and other systems of interest. And that interaction occurs across an interface boundary. So in that respect, I would have my interface requirements be included along with all my other requirements for the entity that I'm writing the requirements for. In defining that interaction, there are generally three things that we can define. We can define the characteristics of the thing crossing that boundary, what the two systems look like at the boundary, and then the media involved in that interaction. One of the problems is that as a design input, we can define the characteristics of the thing crossing the interface. What the system looks like at the interface and the media used is usually a design output decision. And so one of our challenges is that when we're defining that, the ICD that would contain the definitions is something that is evolving if the systems are being developed concurrently. If a system is already in existence, then its ICD would define all three of those things, and then a new system that would come along that wants to interface with that existing system then would be constrained typically by what's in the existing system's ICD. And when we talk about interface requirements, then what's unique about them is that they state a function, but the performance is what's agreed to in an ICD between the two parties.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Lou. I think it is primarily, I was curious. So you have a system. So there are internal interfaces and there are external interfaces, right?
Yes.
In internal interfaces, you kind of have both physical interface and or logical interface, not always physical, for example. And for external interfaces, it's the same thing again. When we are trying to go through the exercise of leveling the requirements, are these the level of abstraction for each requirement, are they at the right level or not? There comes this question about, I understand what a system level requirement looks like, and I understand what is a subsystem and low level requirements accordingly. But this interface at the system level, at the subsystem where they are interacting, they are there. Is there any strong reason to separate them out or be embedded in their own respective documentation was a question. And how do we verify them was another. So it's all, the more you think about it, you're trying to figure out if there is any standard already that exists.
And that's going to be different, I think, for different organizations at the system level.
Yeah.
If the external systems exist already, then there would be, each would have their own ICD. If there's external systems that are being developed concurrently with my system, then we'd have to have an interface working group and come out with some agreement on how we're going to work together to define the three parts of the definition across the life cycle. When we go internal, then when defining the requirements in the architectural definition process and the design definition process occur fairly concurrently. And once we come up with an architecture for a lower level, and then we allocate the higher level requirements to several different entities at the next level, if those entities have been allocated the same parent requirement, one of the things we look at is, do they have an interaction? If there is an interaction, then they have to define that interaction, and as we discussed. Now, some organizations, because they control the internal interfaces, may choose to have all those documented in one place. If you're going to outsource a piece of your architecture, you may want to have a separate ICD just for contracting purposes. I see Carlo has his hand up.
Yeah, for sure. What I noticed in these years is that in documents and also models dealing with regarding interfaces, often there is a focus on mainly on the function, while the interface has multiple aspects and multiple dimensions. One is for sure a function, and that is tendentially a functional description, but then there is the space occupied, the proximity. The space is not irrelevant. There is the information connected to what the interface is doing or not explicitly doing, but implicitly doing. And then there is the energy related to the interfaces. And all these dimensions have cost, risks. So I saw documents in these years that are only focusing on what the interface has to do, but not what the interface represents in the system or at the boundaries of the system. So it's important for me to keep into account all the aspects of interface. I don't know if this thought can be agreed in general.
This is Henrik again. I can second that. We try to get both aspects. Well, if you want to control the format aspect, that is, but typically it's important to characterize both what is flowing, but also the kind of form aspect. So yeah, I think that is important.
And that's what I talked about. The three things that we're defining is the characteristics of what's crossing the interface, as well as what each system looks like at the boundary and what the media is. And one thing that I talk about in the manual is, even though we typically talk about an interface requirement, the interface itself, when we think about interactions, interface should never be used as a noun because it's not a real thing. It's a boundary condition. And so we wouldn't have a requirement says the interface shall, because it's a boundary. So we want to focus our interface requirements on the interaction across the boundaries that we've identified in our context diagrams and interface diagrams. And then we would point to the different types of interactions at that. And there could be one interface between two systems, but across that interface boundary, there could be multiple interactions. So we'd want to have individual definitions and then interface requirements pointing to each of those interactions.
Francesco here again. I want to comment that I fully agree with Carlo, and indeed I like to classify interfaces in mass, energy, information, and physical interfaces. With these four categories, you can classify all interfaces. And then continue on this discussion, I would like to know your opinion if it's correct to identify interfaces looking at the functions, at the functional decomposition, and where there are boundaries between functions, but also looking at the work performed by different teams, because often interfaces are determined by the fact that there are maybe two teams that have to, to work to two pieces, and at a certain point they have to connect things either physically or through exchange of information or mass or energy. if we talk, for instance, about electrical connections, for instance. So I would like to know the opinion on how to treat interfaces that are identified through the functional decomposition and interfaces that are determined by the work performed by different teams.
And that's why I don't like to use the word interface as a noun and talk about interfaces. I like to talk about interactions, because then it takes away some of the ambiguity in defining those interactions. When there are two different groups that are working on each side of the interface boundary, then they have to agree on how they're going to interact, no matter what type of interaction is taking place.
Agreed. So just to summarize, Lou, I think is that, would it be correct to say for the first question, are interface requirements a separate section of system or subsystem? Not necessarily, it could be embedded, it really depends, is the answer. Or is it a separate document such as ICD? Again, it depends if that is an existing system or is a system under development. Again, I think the second question, where do they reside in the document-centric world? It could be probably a section in your design input documentation, or also a section in ICD.
In the manual, we talk about ways of organizing your requirements. I include form, fit, function, and then quality and compliance. Interface requirements could apply to form, fit, function. And so in my mind, what I like to do is, if the interaction involves a critical function, I put that in the functional section. If it's a enabling interaction, then I would put it under the fit. Power or physical bolting two things together, heating and cooling, cold plate kind of things, I would put that under the fit piece. And then if it has to do with the primary or critical function of the system, I would put it under functional. It really doesn't make sense to me, and I've worked in some organizations that have done it, where they have functional requirements, and then they have what they call operational requirements about how the system interacts with its external environment. And then they have a separate section just for interface requirements. But a lot of systems, their primary critical functionality involves an interaction with some other system. And so by definition, there's going to be an interface requirement pointing to whatever that interaction is.
Maybe just to add to previous question about interaction between teams, just this simple thing of having the ICD, we have seen kind of solve an important collaboration issue, especially when you have different design teams designing parts that interact, and it's super easy to get a mismatch there if each team manage their own kind of design specification or something like that. But as soon as you have the ICD as the contract between the teams, I think that is just that thing is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and continuing on this topic, which I have quite an interest, I would like to know which is the opinions of this audience about the role of interface requirement specification and interface control documents, because it has been repeated that requirements can be captured into interface control documents. I would like to know if this is the good practice. In my domain, we don't do that. In my domain, interface control documents stay at the design level. It is basically a way between two or more teams to agree on how to realize a defined interface, and the agreement has been already agreed before. And in case there is a fixed interface, like for instance, when you were to connect to the public electricity, in that case we call it interface definition document, because there is no agreement between the parties. It is a constraint imposed by some external authorities like the public electricity provider. Is that correct, or there are different ways to do that in different domains? I would like to know more on that.
Quick question, Francisco. Are you verifying those requirements at all when you put them as part of design, you said?
Sorry, can you repeat? If I'm verifying the requirement?
Yeah. Are you verifying those interface specifications?
What do you mean by verifying? Verifying the system meets those requirements, or verifying the requirements are well written?
Exactly.
The former, system meets those requirements or not? Are you doing any?
Yes, it must be done, because it is part of the system to have the capability to interact with another system. So it must be verified. it is a system characteristic. But I do not understand why this is connected to my question, which is focused on the difference between interface requirement specification and interface control documents, which I have defined for you are the same or similar, and for me they are very different.
There's a classic terminology that we use. In the manual, we talk about top level requirements as design inputs. So you would have functional requirements dealing with an interaction pointing to an ICD. And then as the design matures, then you would add the design details on how that interaction is actually implemented, ending up in a mature interface control document. Different organizations will use different names for the different type of documents where we define the interactions. The classic is the interface control document. Sometimes it's a fixed document for an existing system. Other cases, the ICD can be an evolving document that evolves with the design. And then, like was mentioned, interface definition document, internal interface definition document. Some people will use the terms IRD or IRS, interface requirement document, or interface requirement specification. And I think that's one of your questions. And I do not agree with using the R in those documents because that implies the shell statements. And some organizations will actually move all their interface requirements out of their system requirement document and put them in this document. And to me, that's totally wrong. The interface requirements need to be included with all your other requirements for your system. They shouldn't be put in a separate document. The main thing is that you understand that for two systems being developed concurrently, the definition interface is going to evolve as the design evolves in response to the design input interface requirement. So the interface requirement is just another type of functional requirement, and then the definitions have to be agreed to and documented someplace else. Eventually, once the system is built, then you'll have an ICD that defines all the design details. And then that would be classified in my mind as a design output specification that would define exactly how the system needs to be coded or built to allow the interaction defined as a design input requirement.
What we do there, so I understand you may want to have a separate definition of this side of the interface versus that side of the interface. What we do, we bring that into the same document and we just call it ICD. As I see it, you could probably break it out into separate documents, but
I don't think you want to have each organization defining and controlling their own version of the definition. There needs to be one definition that both point to.
Absolutely not. That's right. So there need to be a coordination in that case. But I'm just saying, if you want one data point, we describe both sides of the interface in what we refer to as the ICD, and we manage that. And when we talk about versions of an interface that exist then within that document, and you version manage both sides together. And yeah, we've seen that works pretty well for what we do.
Let's move to the next question. So we talk about planning for system integration testing. Against what requirements should you be testing to? Anyone want to speak up about how they address verifying the system meets the interface requirements, and when do you do that? Is it a prerequisite prior to integrating your system with the larger system as a part?
Here is a really interesting question. Typically, what I see is that the verification of the interface requirements really is given for granted, for successful until you are not at the integration phase. While at subsystem level, there are component level, let's call it this way. There are typically many activities, physical or simulated or whatever. Typically, verifying the interface requirements is a sort of given. Only when you integrate do you discover that unfortunately it's not so, and that interfaces plays a role. So it can be sometimes also too late. For example, we discovered a few times ago before summer that everything worked in a relatively complex subsystem, but every single part was okay and the requirement could be satisfied by testing it alone or embedded, etc. But then, when it tried to integrate it, we discovered that there was not enough space, really space, to put one component among two of the other ones. Fundamentally, at the simulation level, that was possible, but it's a completely different thing to insert one physical part correctly among two others. It can look a little trivial, but this determined the failure of this alternative at the end of the story, because the component could be put in the position, but it was impossible to keep it in that position for not more than one night. For example, in this project, we didn't write any testing specification for the interface before the integration. That gave out as a result the failure of at least a couple of architecture alternatives. And that was really sad, because the subsystem was a good idea, but unfortunately this part was missed. I hope it is significant.
Extremely valuable comment and observation. I found in my experience that during system integration of the parts, starting at the bottom and working up what we classically say the right side of the SEV, is that the majority of the issues occur at an interface boundary. And so when you're talking about system integration, that you have a good idea that you have verified in some manner the interface requirements for your system of interest. And if you don't have the actual system, can you build an emulator or simulator or something to simulate that external system so that you can make sure that your system does what it's supposed to do at that interface boundary based on what was defined in the ICD that your interface requirement points to? It's really critical that we have some methodology to make sure that our interface requirements are met by our system of interest. And ideally, you do that earlier during the design phase or as an early verification phase before you do the actual integration, and then start testing the higher level system. I think another point you made, Carlo, is that in our modeling world, we can address a lot of interface issues early in our models, but then when it comes to the actually putting the physical pieces together within a volume or something, that kind of thing isn't addressed within SysL models. It's more of a behavior model and it doesn't address some of the physical things that we have to talk about. And also we have to understand in the definition of interactions that was mentioned earlier, there's energy. What is the thermal conditions allowed for one component? How hot can it get? Or what operating environment does it have to operate within given the thermal characteristics of other parts? Again, these are all things that exist in the physical world that are more difficult to model. A lot of the physics interactions, the EMI, EMC.
Absolutely, and one of the typically missing points that I experience day by day is that there are interactions which are explicit, and it's only a question of willingness to document them, to test them, etc. And explicit, sorry. And there are other ones which are implicit because they are not in a first grade connection, but they come after along the line of connections. And then you discover them only when you assemble them, because it's very difficult to think of everything which can happen along the rest of the system due to a single interface which looks isolated. The typical phrasing of my exercise is that this component cannot produce failure to the system. This is the typical statement. And then typically that component produces a failure to the entire system. It's like the stupid example of a plug-in component. If you don't plug in something, all the rest of the system doesn't work simply because you must do it. It's trivial, stupid, but you have to do it. So managing the explicit dependencies and the interactions is relatively easy. But managing the implicit dependencies is very difficult. It requires a lot of time, and typically projects or Scrum teams don't have time to think to all these possible interactions. This is something I see every day, unfortunately.
Anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, I try to answer those questions. I would say that against what requirements should they be tested to? Against the interface requirements. And probably here would be helpful to make also examples. So if I say, I don't know, the car shall have a power of 200 horses plus minus 5 horses, for instance, that is not an interface requirement, is about the system car itself. But if I say that the car shall connect to a public electric station for recharging, just to give you an example, that is an interface requirement because you need to have an interaction between the recharge system of the car and the public charging stations that usually are defined via some standards. And in that case, we call those interface definition documents because basically there is no agreement between parties. That is a constraint. These are public stations with their rules and constraints. And if you want to connect to that one, you have to stick on that regulations. And of course, you can verify that the interface you want to realize is well fit that public charging station. So you can plan a test that you check that the cable from the car to the charging station is working within the limits predefined. So the second question, my answer will be yes. There are requirements about external interfaces and we test them. And do we write requirement for external interface? Yes. So this would be my answer to those questions.
Context for the second bullet there is I have a system and it needs to share its data to an external entity, like an external cloud server or something like that. Now, I know from my end, my system has the hooks to share that data, whatever the basic fundamentals that are needed, the functionality, so that any approved external system can access the data that I'm ready to send. So the discussion there was, I can probably on my end, I can check that I'm able to share the data to the external system. But the acknowledgement coming from the external system, the communication that goes from to and fro from the external system, is that something that I am forced to check? Or is that something on the other side of the entity should also be making sure? If that external entity is its own separate system, then if I treat that as a not part of my system, so then what does that contract look like, basically?
I would answer that it depends on the situation. I can try to describe two different situations. For instance, in my case, I work in astrophysics. We build observatories. And nowadays, we want to share, to be open, and to share the data that we acquire. Therefore, we are looking for standardizing how to provide data. The way we do that, we try to create committees from different observatories, and we try to define standards so people can apply to those standards in order to be open and to share as much as possible the data that we acquire. This is one scenario. It is not contractual. It's a collaboration where people are looking for standardization in order to know how to design and realize those links to the external world. Differently, you may have contractual constraints. So the situation can be completely different if you have contracts where it should be written when your responsibility ends. So if the contract says you have to respect that specific standard, you just need to test and verify that you are compliant with that standard. You should not go further. The other party should do the same and perform again that part of the test from their side. So it depends from the contractual scenario, I can imagine. Maybe there are even more scenarios that are not coming to my mind now.
It's a good question, and I totally agree with what you just said, Francisco. If it's an existing system, then you have that IDD that you were talking about, an interface definition document. That is a constraint. You could have a standard, just like we have USB buses, different versions of that. The ICD for our system could point to a standard that we're going to meet that, then it's our responsibility for verifying we met that standard. If it's an existing system that's defined how we need to interact with them, then we're going to have a means of being able to verify that at the interface boundary that we meet the definitions that were in their ICD. If it's two systems being developed in parallel, then the two sides are going to have to agree on the definition, and then both sides would have a responsibility to verifying that at the boundary, they both meet what was agreed to for the definitions, both in the characteristics, what they look like, and the media involved. That's to verify each of those. In some organizations, if you don't have access to that other external system, then they'll build a emulator, simulator of that external system that they can use as part of their system verification activities.
Makes sense. Thank you.
And one thing was alluded to in Carlo's comments was that we need to always remember that when we're testing the integrated system, both from a verification that it meets its design input requirements, but also validation that it meets the needs, we have to understand that the behavior of the system is a function of the interactions of the parts that make it up, as well as a function of the system interacting with its external environment and the systems that exist in the external environment and the people that exist in the external environment. As the complexity of our system starts increasing, one big concern is the concept of cascade failures, which I think Carlo is alluding to, is I can have an issue at one interface boundary that could perpetuate itself across multiple boundaries and cause the whole system to fail. I think that was one of the problems that they had with the 737 MAX. And so we're looking at emerging properties when we're doing this testing, and a lot of the emerging properties have to do with the behavior that's associated with all those interactions that occur. And there can be, I don't know, hundreds, maybe in some cases, thousands of interactions within the system, depending how it's formed. And how do we test to make sure every combination and permutation of the interactions, it really becomes difficult. And that's one reason why, from a behavior standpoint, why we want to put a lot more emphasis in modeling, is so that modeling can help identify these issues before we complete the design and before we build something, so we can address those earlier in the life cycle. Because like Carlo mentioned, it's really not a good idea to wait until we actually integrate in the physical parts to find problems.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Just imagine in these days, these years, if only one interface opens the door to security problems, then the full system is potentially lost. And this is one interface very difficult to be understood sometimes. And other ones obviously are easier, to be honest. But I agree with you. Thank you.
And that's really a big concern when we're talking about the concept of systems, where we don't have control of the constituent systems. And if they have a security issue, that could mean that the whole systems has a security issue. That's definitely a problem. So the last question here, what drove that one?
No, it's just going back to the drawing board to say, okay, what are some considerations when dealing with defining interfaces and level of testing those interfaces? So the context here is, again, we identify there are system boundaries, and we identify there are multiple constituent systems and also external systems. I think we kind of covered this. I heard we talked about interface definition document, where we clearly define what we mean. What is this type of interface? Is it physical, logical? What are the other aspects of those interfaces? When do they show up? And what stage a certain functionality is expected from those interfaces? We talked about security, so privacy security. Nowadays, cybersecurity. If your system is part of data sharing kind of a thing. Yeah, I think that's where I was coming from. Are there any specific non-negotiables and must-haves you have in mind that you go with before you start putting things together on paper, or is it something really depends on the system, from system to system? So just curious.
One consideration from my side that maybe is obvious, however, I consider it very important, is that whenever we have to deal with a system, there is not a unique way to identify and then define interfaces, as well as there are multiple ways to decompose a system and to have functional breakdowns. Similarly, you can have different sets of interfaces depending how you want to perform that. And actually, for me, it's a measure how good is, for instance, an architecture if you're able to minimize interfaces without affecting the system capabilities. And it depends where you want to put your control and your attention. Because, for instance, I can say that if you want to connect your car, as I said before, to a public charging station, there is an interface because there is a service provider, and you need to connect to what the service provider is offering to you. However, there are similar electrical interfaces at any level of a system. If you take a car, it can be between the light and the central control unit of the car, but also within the central control unit of the car, maybe there is an electrical connection between one chip, a buffer, and an amplifier. And the concept is the same. So it depends on us where we want to put our attention and where we want to put the control. And this is why, in my understanding, at the end of the day, when we are at the design level, we have interface control document because those allow us to control those boundaries where there are interactions between elements that we have created. It's our, let's say, work to decompose a system in a way that is manageable and can be realized efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting on that, and the interfaces at the system boundary is probably fairly stable, or at least in our case. But to your point there, depending on your architecture, internal interfaces can be a little bit different depending on how you choose to create that architecture, or different functional architectures drives different internal interfaces. So for a given architecture, we definitely see that the internal interfaces are fairly stable, but you want to describe them at the lower levels as well, so you give enough guidance to the design teams. But a different architecture will definitely have some variation on the internal interfaces, but not necessarily on the external. So I think that is kind of a characteristic we see there.
A couple of points I want to make before we end is, one is this last question talked about level of testing interfaces. If we're starting on the bottom of the right side of the V, and we have a bunch of system elements that we're going to integrate into subsystems and then subsystems into the system, some organizations, in order to cut cost, will say, let's integrate the system elements into subsystems, and then we'll do our testing against the subsystems. Some organizations will actually say, let's integrate everything together and just do testing at the system level. As it talks about in the manual, it's a risk-based decision to do that. If I find an interface issue at lower levels of architecture that causes a problem at the system level, one is I may have difficult finding the exact specific interface, especially when it comes to cascading failures where the issue was. So then I got to go through a bunch of troubleshooting, and then when I think I found the problem, then I've got to take the system apart, deassemble it, and address that particular problem. So the more you cut back on lower level testing, the more risk you have when it comes to issues you find at the higher levels. So that's one consideration. Another consideration that we have is when we issue contracts. So I have a customer and they're going to do the integration, but they issue contracts for certain subsystems or system elements, and those elements are going to be built from scratch. Then how do you handle in the contract the fact that the actual interface definition is not known when the contract is released? Because the interface definition evolves as the architecture and design evolve, and until those are complete, you may not know exactly what the interactions are And so the supplier for that part is at risk because the interface hasn't been totally designed when the contract happens. And there's some decisions that may be made that can have an influence on the cost of development of that subsystem or that system element. The third consideration is if I'm actually going to buy off the shelf components, they weren't built to my specifications. So I may actually have to include in there some kind of an adapter to be able to adapt that off the shelf system so it can work within my system. And I think all three of those could be another hour of discussion. But if anyone has any quick comments on those, go ahead and make those, and then we'll draw this to a close.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lou. I think the motivation for that is sometimes the system integration piece, which is kind of dependent on the interfaces that we choose, is conveniently ignored as we try to integrate things and try to come up with a program schedule. So I'm trying to see where this fits in and why is it so important to have that integration testing at the interfaces.
Some of you, I think, have probably heard of the concept of technology readiness levels, and there's manufacturing readiness levels. There's also a concept, and you can look up on the internet, called integration readiness levels. When you look at those integration readiness levels, you see that they're very much focused on the interfaces themselves. Something you can look up, interface readiness levels. So I want to thank you for presenting these questions. Like I said, the other topics, I think we've covered a lot of these, but there's a lot more. So again, I encourage you to read these sections that I talk about in the Needs and Requirements Manual. Hopefully they answer a lot of your questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to send me an email with your specific questions, and I will do my best to provide an answer to those. So any closing comments by anybody?
Lou, one suggestion. When our discussion was very fruitful and useful, it was a bit theoretical. What about if in the future we keep the same topics, but we have a discussion around examples and we try to build something real in order to be more concrete? Do you think it would be beneficial, the discussion on those interesting topics?
Oh, absolutely. Then you suggested it. I would invite you to put together something like that and host it. That could be an upcoming session that we schedule. And then I would be happy to let you lead the discussion. You come up with the framework. Probably would work best if you had some kind of a case study or some example that could be used. So for next year, if you want to do that, that could be one of the topics that we do in our presentations the week before IW, or it could be our monthly sessions that we have in 2023. So if you want to put something together like that, I think people would really enjoy that.
We'll discuss about that. Okay, thank you very much. Very nice discussion.
Yes. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording